Obviously a load of rubbish. In fact, how you are motivated is the sum total of everything which has happened to you personally since you were little and how you reacted to it. Or possibly even before you were little. It may be genetic. If you're born stupid, you'll probably stay stupid. If you go to school and you get badly treated at school, this can have a big effect on how you interact socially for a long time. And I think choosing people just on motivation normally works very well, except I have been in a hostile area with somebody for 2 months, thought they were brilliant, and then noticed the bad side of their character, which could be dangerous later on. And in our team, when we notice someone like that, what we do is to sack them instantly. None of this sort of sideways promotional pussyfooting, which just keeps rotten apples in the barrel. You might think it's all very well for someone like me to talk about sacking people, whereas in the real world, of course, you're not allowed to. In the UK, we have something called the Industrial Relations Act, which is designed to stop you sacking people that ought to be sacked. We, in Antarctica, have a much worse problem, which is you can sack them, but you can't get rid of them. Basically, my own motivation goes back to when I was 1 year old in Windsor, outside the castle where I was born. And at that time, it was being bombed during the war, which my mother did not like. So she moved all of my sisters, and me aged 1, out to South Africa for 12 years without consulting us. I have to say, it was a really nice place to get brought up, except that academically, it was way behind the UK. Today it's probably the other way around, but that's the way it was. So when we all got back to Europe, my mother had no money. She was looking for somewhere to educate us, and was very happy when she found a place called Winchester College, which took anybody totally free of charge, providing you passed a certain level of exam and that your name was Fiennes. The reason for this was because the man that built the college 800 years ago had been called Fiennes and liked the idea of lots of little Fienneses going there free. Also because in those days there were very few of us, so it was economically safe for the college. But more recently we started to breed like rabbits, mostly actors, and it became unsafe for the college. So they changed the rules, and after that you could only get in free if you got the top level of entrance exam. And due to my African background, I got the bottom level, and they would not accept me, to my mother's disappointment. In fact, the only place which would take people with such a low level of intellect was, of course, Eton College. So I went there for about 5 years, but my level of intellect was so low that I couldn't even keep up with theirs. Luckily, there was boxing, which did not require too much intellect. And eventually, I tried to get A-levels, because what I wanted to do, the only thing I wanted to do, was to become what my father had been when he was killed in the war, which was to command a famous Scottish cavalry regiment. But in his day, you did not require to pass exams. By the time I arrived on the scene, you had to get your A-levels. But if I stayed at Eton, I would not get them because the place is badly designed for getting people A-levels. And I was sent to a famous place in Brighton called Davis's. And if you went there, when you came out the other end, you definitely had your A-levels. I'm not at all proud of having broken their record. This was not my fault, because at that time was the height of the mini-skirt era, and concentration was not therefore possible. So I failed the A-levels twice. But obviously, if you cannot go where you want to go, like Sandhurst Military College, you've got to find an alternate route. And I found a place called Mons Cadet School. If you went there for 5 months and you could prove to the sergeant majors that under a situation of great stress, you could dig holes in straight lines, you could become an officer in the British Army. So I did this, and I got sent out to Germany for 5 years. It was the Cold War, and I spent the whole of that period in tanks, learning how to retreat from the German border. Not practice advancing, which got pretty boring. So when I saw a notice on the regimental board asking for officers to apply for the SAS, Special Forces, I put my name down, not because I knew anything about the regiment. It was before Prime Minister Wilson used them for PR purposes. I had obviously heard of Scandinavian airline services, but not the regiment. So I got sent to Hereford, which is where you go to get selected for the unit. And I found there were 190 soldiers trying to get into the regiment, 24 other officers. All of them were built like brick houses. Many of them had red berries, ex-paras. None of them came from a cavalry regiment. They called me a donkey walloper. So I was quite happy when these guys were ruthlessly eliminated in only 10 days, down to only 3 soldiers and 2 officers. And to my surprise, I was still there. I think probably because they were selecting people on a physical, not intelligence point of view. Unfortunately, on the 11th day, they switched. So I had to try to become alert. And I can remember, if you failed anything, you got thrown out of the regiment immediately. And what me and the other particular guy was trying to do one night was to cross the local river by night in winter with no clothes on for some military reason. So I woke up extremely tired the following morning at about 11 o'clock. We meant to get up at 6 o'clock. And I panicked because they leave your instructions every day on your bed. And what it was that particular day was to steal £200,000 from the local bank. In great detail, which the SAS checked. I had Barclays Bank, the other officer had Lloyd's. So I rushed down to the town, but the bank was already closed, so I could not get in to do a careful burglary plan. So I went around the back and I banged on the back window. And luckily the bank manager came out, a charming man, very naive. And I explained that I had come from Germany. I was trying to get into the SAS. I brought all my family's silver with me. It was not true. And he said, no problem, Barclays, we are very secure. He showed me all the electronic system, so I thanked him. Copied everything down in carbon paper, 1 copy to the SAS colonel, just in time. And me and the other officer had the day off, so we went up to Birmingham, we saw a film and had a spaghetti dinner. And very stupidly after dinner, I left my copy of the bank raid plan in the restaurant. And the manager, later in court, basically what happened, gave the plans to the police. There was a ministerial inquiry in Westminster, front page of the Times, why SAS officers were stealing from banks. I was up before the commanding officer who said any more behaviour like this and I would be thrown out of the SAS immediately. Well, for the next year or so in the regiment in different parts of the world doing different things, I behaved pretty well. But briefly back in the UK, unfortunately, I got telephoned by an old Eton friend who by that time, like most of them, had become a wine salesman in the West Country. And during the course of selling his wine in pubs, he had discovered a village called Castle Coombe, which had just been voted Europe's prettiest village by the Americans. And it was being attacked by 20th Century Fox, making a film in this beautiful village called Dr. Dolittle, which involved building this beautiful stream with thatched cottages into a huge lake for filming, ruining the village with a 20-foot-high concrete barrage. My friend decided to bring this outrage to the general attention by blowing up the entire concrete dam the night before the film started. It was a good PR plan. Unfortunately, the police got to hear about it. They put Alsatian dogs all over the dam, but my friend had been at Eton, so what he did was to rent 8 Alsatian bitches in order to put them upwind of the dam. But at the last minute, the bitches failed to turn up, so he telephoned me to ask if I would stand in. This was because he knew I had just completed an army explosives course where you learn to blow up as much as you can using as little as possible. And I was pretty good at this, so I had a lot left over at the end of every day. It seemed stupid to give it back to Her Majesty, so I put it in the boot. And 2 months later, the boot was full of explosives. And what better way of getting rid of it than this public-spirited gesture? Unfortunately, the police caught everybody. I was not physically caught. I'd been doing another army course on escaping from dogs by night. But they had the car numbers. I ended up in prison. I was on police probation for 6 months. I was thrown out of the SAS regiment, back to my own regiment, who were still retreating from the German border. Well, I put up with that for about another year, and then I saw a notice on the regimental board asking for officers to apply for the Sultan of Oman's forces. You probably don't remember, but at that time, world Marxism was doing very well. They had just chucked the Brits out of the Yemen and were about to move into the Oman in order to block 80% of the free world's oil. Therefore, the socialist Prime Minister in the UK agreed to send the Sultan a massive show of military strength, which he did. There were about 9 of us at that time. I can remember applying to the colonel for this job, but all the other officers were turned down because they were too valuable to the regiment. But my application went through immediately. And what the Ministry of Defence think is you cannot command Arabs in the dark being shot at by communists if you cannot speak Arabic. So first of all, you get sent to the best place in the world for learning Arabic, according to the ministry, which is Beaconsfield in North London. I did fail the course, but I was still sent out. And on arrival, you meet your works team for the first time. And I have to say they were a piratical-looking group. There were 60 of them. Most were Baluchi, so they could only speak Urdu. Many of them were Zanzibaris who spoke only Swahili. And the few that did speak Arabic had not been to Beaconsfield. So we ended with a major communications problem. But going back to motivation, it was probably out there that I began to get a taste for travel in very remote parts of the world. This is the navy of the Sultan of Oman, the army. This is my reconnaissance platoon, normally very well disciplined, but on this occasion we were about to attack Rakhut held by machine guns, so they were apprehensive and seasick. But that is one half of the Sultan's Air Force. Photograph, obviously, from the other half. If you look very carefully, typical Omani, Zanzibari, Baluchi, myself, European, all of us were, of course, Muslim. I was Muslim for the 3 years I was out there. A lot of people think of Arabia as being sand. It is 99% sand, but where we were fighting the war was not like that. Because of a monsoon with rain 3 months a year, it was like forests and rivers and jungle, like Scotland. That's where the war was going on. We were a total of 180 soldiers in the Sultan's army in Dhofar, South Oman. The opposition, the enemy, were between 4,000 and 5,000, very well trained in Odessa in the Soviet Union, so we were heavily outnumbered. I therefore changed from 6 Land Rovers to just making them move on foot in groups of 4, maximum 4, moving only by night for 3 years, with 2 machine guns per group and walkie-talkies per group. That way you can deal with many more people than yourselves. There were no helicopters, so if somebody was badly wounded, it would be better to shoot them in that place. The place that we were moving by night was not like the rest of Arabia. Unfortunately, there were more snakes here than any other country in the world, and if you are bitten by an Echis carpet viper, you will be dead within 2 seconds. And we have the PM, which is even quicker. That is a Soviet anti-personnel mine. You're sitting in a cave on the border with the Yemen, waiting for the political execution squads to come into the Oman in order to do very nasty things to the Muslims to change them into Marxists. We were there on the border to stop them coming in. But you could be sitting in a cave for 6 nights, 7 nights, as much water as you can carry, and nothing happens, so it's very boring. So when I was on holiday in London, I went to the British Museum, and they taught me how to photograph and measure new insects and scorpions and lizards, because no botanist had ever been in this country before. If you go to the British Museum today, and you look in the scorpion section, there is a 35 centimetre scorpion with my name on it. I'm very proud of it. I stroke it when I go there. The chameleons out there, you may recognise chameleons. If you put them on a green leaf, they will go green. You put them on a red flower, they will actually turn red. People say if you put them on a tartan blanket, they will explode. The people, 16 different tribes, like the Bauta Khawri, the Makhra, the Shakra, the Beit Kathiri, we had to recognize them sometimes by the scars on their face. These are the Bauta Khawri tribe, descended from the Queen of Sheba. If you read the Bible, you would know that Sodom got buried because the people were bad and God put sand on top. Well, in the Quran, you have Uba, or Irem al-Adad, and that is a lost city famous for frankincense, because this is the only country in the world where frankincense trees grow. And in the Roman Empire, frankincense was more valuable commodity than gold or silver. So it was a clever place for the Ethiopians of Queen Sheba to colonize. The people in the 1960s became very poor because incense lost its value. By the time I got there, if you compare European poverty with this, imagine this is your house. You've got a house of maybe 3 rooms over on the right. I knew these people. It was a family of 15 human beings. Over there, you've got a sitting room. 15 people live in that kitchen, and the garage over on the left. That is everything that you have got. You live off the camel's milk and maybe some dates, and when the camel has no grass, you put your house on the camel and find some more grass, or you're in bad trouble. And that is your life. If you're lucky when you're 12 years old, you might marry someone slightly better off. We tried to protect them, but we were heavily outnumbered by the communists. We didn't do very well. And also, we had to patrol a huge area of desert. The whole of the Saudi Arabian, Yemeni, Omani border, we patrolled with only 6 vehicles. If you went too many times on the same track, then they would lay anti-tank mines, which would blow a Land Rover 100 meters, and the people further than that. The city which I started to look for was where the incense had been before it was buried. Ptolemy, who did the first map of the world, put the city on his map. So I started to look for it in 1967. By 1992, when I found the lost city, I'd spent 26 years and 8 major expeditions into the Empty Quarter, which is the biggest sand desert in the world. I had to leave the Sultan's army, not because I wanted to, but because I was posted from the British Army, and after 8 years, you get thrown out of the army if you have not passed your exams at university. So after 8 years, I suddenly found myself thrown out. I got married at that time. She also had no money. And the only thing that I had been trained to do in the Cold War in Germany was teaching Scottish soldiers how to canoe and ski and climb in order to stop them beating each other up in the canteen, which they did because they were bored, because the Soviet army never bothered to attack. Now, that was paid for by the taxpayer, but with my wife doing it, no taxpayer, we had to look for sponsors. Nobody never heard of us, 1967, and we started very, very slowly. We did 10 expeditions in the first 10 years. I'll just examples 2 of them. This was the first ever journey complete up the longest river in the world, which is the Nile, which is 4,000 miles long. My wife, my late wife Ginny, at breakfast one morning, she decided that that's what we would do. she decided that we would use hovercraft. They're called hover hawks, and they had the Guinness Book of Records record of having hovered for 8 hours without a breakdown. So they're obviously the correct model for the Nile. They had 3 motorbike engines which could lift them 2 centimeters above the surface. We took 9 months to complete the Nile, partly because there were a lot of 4-centimeter obstacles. Just to show you how different the expeditions are, one of the others, around about 1971, Vancouver, which is the capital of British Columbia, which is bigger than 3 Great Britons, but almost entirely full of forest. They had their centenary celebration that year because they had been a Canadian province for 100 years. The people who discovered British Columbia travelled by river because there were no roads and only forest. And they went from the Yukon in the north, 2,000 miles by 9 rivers, down to Vancouver on the United States border. But none of them did all the journey, which is 2,000 miles. So the government of British Columbia, in their centenary, asked a Scottish group, because it was the Scottish who discovered the country, to try to do the first journey all the way from border to border. I was asked to lead the expedition. I was on the Army Reserve by then, and the Army promised me a BER Land Rover. I later discovered that that meant beyond economical repair. They also said that if I went to Scotland, to Edinburgh, I could select the best 3 soldiers out of 600, but when I got there, the only ones who were there were the regimental cooks, so the choice was not good. But I did find a very fine Scotsman called Joseph Skibinski, and the 3 of them were given a total of 6 weeks army leave. We took 8 months, so they were not popular when they got back. One reason was that none of us had been on bad water before, but the ministry only gave us training on the River Thames in London. So when we got to know about water, that rock causes a hydraulic. That boat is 6 meters long. We had 4 boats with 3 people in each boat. On the Hell's Gate Rapid, one of our boats was turned over. We found their bodies a mile downstream, which could have stopped the entire expedition, but luckily it was just the BBC film crew. Round about 1971, we had a big problem. Whatever you do, you must look at changing fashion, even in expeditions, because we depend on sponsors who depend on media, and the media from New York, which is where the fashion starts changing, then it'll come to Europe. Well, at that time, the New York media did not want any more hot expeditions. They only wanted cold ones. So my wife decided that we would have to change and go cold. We had spent an entire winter in Scotland, but we needed a lot of colder stuff than that. So she decided that what we must do was the first ever journey around the world, 52,000 miles vertically, passing through both poles. She sent me to a library to find out the best route. I quickly discovered that there was a white bit at the bottom called Antarctica, and at the top, which you cannot see, there was another problem, 2,500 miles of frozen sea moving around. Both places had never been crossed from one side to the other by the world's experts. So I went home and I told my wife, as you would, that it was a stupid idea. She became quite unpleasant, so I therefore went back to the library. Basically, if you want sponsorship, you have got to be first, not second. And we knew that. We knew that we must hurry because the Americans were desperate to be first to both poles. They didn't want to go the whole way around like my wife Ginny did, but both poles. So we were in a hurry. But if you have no money, and just imagine for a moment it is your husband or your wife at breakfast when you have no money who suggests you do the first journey around Earth. You will need a big icebreaker, which is £6 million minimum, you will need an aeroplane with skis, not for flying. We did not fly 1 meter of the entire journey, but we did have parachutes dropped ahead of us. And that took me 6 years to find somebody who would give us a free ski plane. We had an army barracks in the middle of London, and they let us have an attic which had been used for rifle shooting, but they did not give us a telephone. Now, if you want sponsorship for everything, you do need a telephone. So at night, we put a territorial soldier who was a post office engineer out of the window onto the roof, and he clipped us onto the military phone system, and they sponsored us with a free telephone for 7 years. We ended with 1,900 sponsor companies, and it took us working every day, every week, every year, paid nothing in order to mount this expedition. But eventually it got going. We had 800 people just like you, who would be prepared to give up 4 years of your life without pay, joining the expedition. I only chose 2 out of 800, not by their skill, but by their character, because you cannot change character and you can teach skills. We eventually got down to where the 0 meridian hits Antarctica. As I say, there were people from 9 different countries on that ship who would be with us for 4 years unpaid. They dropped the land group here. They unloaded a lot of equipment, but unfortunately the ice breaks up and you've got to be very quick to unload. When the ship disappeared, we're on the Pacific. They went round to the, we're on the Atlantic. They went round to the Pacific, to New Zealand, and they waited there for 18 months, hoping that we would complete the first ever complete crossing on the surface of Antarctica from one side to the other. In those days, there were, of course, no sat-nav, no sat phone, no GPS. Not until 1994 did GPS and satellites come to Antarctica. The ship went away, and we then tried to go inland, climbing up to 10,000 feet above sea level. 1 meters divided by 3, and up there, when we got in 400 miles to the edge of human exploration, and there we sat for 8 months, waiting for the dark period to go away. My wife designed houses made of paper, which you paint, and they're very light, so they can be parachuted. The mountain there was the last place on Earth. From that point, for 900 miles to the South Pole, no human being knew what was there. It was unmapped, there were no satellites. We had to wait for 8 months on the edge of the unexplored zone until the sun came back. These huts can withstand minus 30 centigrade. We recorded minus 122 degrees centigrade, so you might think that we got cold. They can withstand 40-mile-an-hour wind. We recorded 160-mile-an-hour wind, so you might think that we were blown over. But they depend upon snow coming up to that level, giving you insulation and protection, but then you cannot get out. You might ask, why would you want to get out? The answer basically is we were cooking with gasoline in a paper house. My wife became Europe's top Morse code frequency engineer on high frequency radio. Of course, there's no sat phone. Now you just ring up, it's no problem, but then it was a big problem. Her frequency prediction was better than Marconi. We practiced crossing crevasses. You may know that there are over 15,000 deep crevasses, 100 meter deep, on the crossing of Antarctica, whichever way you go. You cannot see them because in winter the snow blows over them. If you want to know where they are, tread on them and fall into them, and then you will know where they were. We practiced, which in the UK is difficult, outside the camp because that one had already fallen in. After 8 months, the sun came back, the thermometer rose to minus 68 centigrade, so we decided to set out into the unknown area. We said goodbye to the base commander. That is the worst job on an expedition. That is why I gave it to my wife, because the whole thing had been her fault for thinking of it in the first place. Unfortunately, she was a small person and could not roll big drums of gasoline about, so a man had to be working and living with my wife for 3 years. So I did not want somebody who was physically attractive in that position. But luckily we found a Yorkshireman for that particular job. We did cross the unexplored zone. We made the first map of this area bigger than France. 3 years later, satellites made world terrestrial mapping redundant. We used a tent which weighed 120 pounds, 60 kilos. Today our tent weighs only 3, but that tent can withstand katabatic wind. A katabatic wind will go from 0 to 100 miles an hour in less than 1 minute, which doesn't give you much time to put your tent up properly. So we used the best tent in the world, which was designed in 1901 by the world's greatest polar explorer of all time, the scientist Captain Scott. We did manage to do the first crossing. We came out at the Pacific. That volcano is the only volcano in the whole of Antarctica, and Antarctica is bigger than China and India put together. 2 days before we arrived there, the world's first tourists to Antarctica came there. Their aeroplane, the DC-10, crashed into the volcano. Everybody was killed. From that point, we could see the next bit of Ginny's expedition. We came out here. She drew the route 10 years before on her school map. If we did cross, which we did, we would send a Morse code message to New Zealand. The ship would come through here. If you read your newspapers last month, you will know that Chinese icebreakers and Russian icebreakers were stuck in here. Well, that year, 2 ships sunk, but our one got through, took us up the other side of the world, Australia, Los Angeles, Vancouver, through the Bering Straits, that is the Soviet Union, that's Alaska. 500 miles north of the Alaskan-Canadian coast is the North Pole. We could not go through here in our ship into the Arctic Sea because you have ice floes weighing 3 million tons, and when they hit each other, your ship will sink. Therefore, when she made the plan 10 years earlier, she decided our ship would go drop our land group in little rubber boats. We would go 1,000 miles up the Yukon River, 800 miles down the Mackenzie River, 2,500 miles through the Northwest Passage, up to the most northerly island in the world. And Ginny gave us a total of 2 months to get from there up to there. But when we got there, we discovered that only 3 expeditions in history had been through the Northwest Passage. And they had taken an average of 3 years to get through. I'm not trying to make a comment on female planning, but they do need to be watched. We had no problem on the Yukon River, but when we got to the Northwest Passage, if you can imagine that that black line is the Canadian coast, at this point, there were only 2 of us. One of them had to leave. 2 of us continued in a 5-meter open boat for 2,000 miles. And when we reached the east and turned north, unfortunately, the sea began to freeze. This is called grease ice. After 2 hours with no wind, it will congeal to porridge ice, at which point the propellers will cavitate and the boat will freeze in. We later discovered that it stayed frozen for the next 9 years. That meant that 2 of us now had to ski for 400 miles over these unmapped mountains to get to the edge of the world, where we would wait for 8 months of darkness before trying to cross the North Pole. Unfortunately, the other guy, South African Charlie Burton, on the 2nd day, the skin fell off the bottom of his foot, leaving raw nerves. He then got hemorrhoids and his language got bad. He then fell over one day and he hit his head on a rock and his eyes filled up with blood. and he started to complain. He basically suggested that he ought to rest for a couple of days. If at that point we had rested for 2 or 3 days, the entire expedition would have failed. And there were 52 people on the team, not just the 2 of us. Charlie did keep going. Sadly, today he's dead, but he was a great guy. He kept going. I've got a picture of his better foot. The problem was that we had a very slow journey as a result of that to get to the edge of the world. When we got there, we spent 8 months on the edge in 2 little huts. About a month before the sun came back, we set out in the dark. We left Ginny in the hut. About a week later, she looked out of the living hut at the stores hut, where all our parachutes were stored. It had caught fire. She tried to put the fire out, did a bad job. Sent a message. We were 200 miles away in the dark, on the way to the North Pole. That steam comes from open water. All the pictures I took for the first month came in the darkness, came out black, so there's no point showing them to you. But that is what it did look like in the dark. We eventually got to the North Pole. We put a flag there, but it's pretty stupid putting a flag there because within 1 hour, that flag will be a kilometre away from the pole, because the ice is sort of floating. If you go there and you want to put your flag there, swim down to the bottom of the sea and put your flag there and it will stay put. But we did not do that. We knew that we wanted to go 1,800 miles to get to the edge of the Arctic by Siberia so our ship could rescue us. We only managed to get 400 miles before the ice broke up in summer. It's very frightening. The ice everywhere breaks. You couldn't travel, so we found a bit of ice which was 3 meters deep, and we hoped that if we floated on it week after week, month after month, that we would eventually get to Greenland, not Siberia. The ice flow got smaller and smaller as the weeks went by, but we never got bored because Charlie had a solar panel which gave us enough power to listen to the BBC World Service for 2 minutes a day, if there was reception. And one particular day, Charlie, with his headsets on, said, "The United Kingdom is at war." So I said, "Who with?" And he said, "Oh, I didn't get that bit." We sat for 5 days of bad radio reception, arguing who the hell we could be at war with. Obviously, we knew that Mrs. Thatcher was aggressive, but we couldn't work out who with. Obviously, we assumed that it was France, but we had no proof. When they said it was Argentina, we thought that was just a stupid BBC joke. We did not get bored, we got visited, 19 of them. The Canadians had promised us that only 10% eat humans, but you cannot ask them which percent they belong to. Our main worry was not the bears. The ice on which we lived was getting smaller and smaller. We sent a Morse code message down to Europe for the ship to come quickly. They tried too early, the ice was too hard, and they made a hole in the ship and began to sink. Cleverly, they rammed ice so that the hole was in the air and used oxyacetylene, but they had to go back south for 2 months for repairs. We were panicking. 5 years earlier, we made canoes with skis, but when the time came, we didn't ever get into the canoes because the ice could move much faster and we had to get out very quickly. We were very lucky. 2 months later, if you look carefully, you can see us down there. The ship got stuck 18 miles away, and we completed the last 18 miles. When we arrived on the ship, humans, for the first and last time in history, had been vertically around Earth 52,000 miles without flying 1 meter off the ground. We arrived, this is a place called Greenwich, which is like 0. We arrived back there within 2 days of the date planned by my late wife 10 years early. We kept our team together in the 1980s and 90s. We broke all records against our rivals, including the Norwegians. We used aerospace technology so that we could move over very thin ice. This is called sugar. If you walked on that, you would go through and it would go over your head at 4 miles an hour. We used amphibious gear as little as possible. Mostly we used balance. In '92, Mr. Gorbachev announced Glasnost Perestroika. I wrote a letter, "Dear Mr. Gorbachev, can I lead the first Western expedition to the pole from Siberia?" That white thing is the North Pole. That is 500 miles away, the Siberian coast. Unfortunately, the only place that we could set out from was a secret Soviet missile base. So I had to sign a contract that I would take no photos while there. I did not, the other members of the team did. When we broke all existing world records from the Soviet Union, when we got back to London, unfortunately I discovered that our opponents, not the Norwegians this time, but the Americans, NASA, in Pasadena, California, they put cameras on the shuttle and they fly up to 170 kilometers and they take photographs, in this case of the Great Desert, where the lost incense city was. And I had been looking for the city for 26 years, and it was extremely irritating having NASA starting to look for my lost city. That is a NASA professor. That photograph taken from the shuttle. Those sand dunes are very high. You have 80 kilometers between each of them. That is North Saudi Arabia, the Great Desert. That's the Indian Ocean. They, NASA, knew where the lost city was, even though it was 10 meters under the sand. They could see it with special bioptics. It's called cheating. They knew that the lost city was there because it was right angles, and only people make things with right angles, so it must be a lost city. Well, we in Europe managed to discover the NASA grid reference of the lost city before they were able to mount their own expedition. We had 6 special vehicles. We moved right out deep into the desert to the exact grid reference of NASA where they said the lost city was. My archaeologist, Dr. Zarings, the best in the world, took one look at the NASA site and he said, this is actually not the lost city. This is a place made by God using right angles in order to fool NASA. We reverted to traditional archaeology, and on the 23rd of November we discovered the long lost city. You go there today, it's the biggest excavation works in Arabia. Just to finish up with, round about the mid-1990s, our main rivals, the Norwegians, decided to do the big polar expedition. Well, when we heard that they were about to do it, we realized that we would have to also try the same year. You cannot let your rivals start free. Now, in 1900, this map was drawn by an Irishman called Shackleton. He decided that his ship from South America would get to Antarctica. 4 of them would try to walk to the pole, at which point they would die of hunger. Therefore, 2 years earlier from Australia, his second ship, these guys would drop food off for him. What happened, in fact, was his ship sunk, so he didn't set out. Had no radio, so these guys dropped the food off, but they were killed, so he didn't drop it off properly. So if he hadn't reached the pole, he would have died anyway, but it was a good plan. It was copied by the great New Zealand climber, Ed Hillary, and Europe's top man, Dr. Fuchs, in 1950s. They did a pincer movement on the pole on the Shackleton plan, 2 separate expeditions. But by the time I'm talking about, in the 1990s, only 4 groups in history had ever crossed Antarctica. There was my wife's Trans-Globe expedition, which I talked about in the 1970s. In the 1990s, there was the American Traverse. Reinhold Messner, the greatest climber in the world, together with Germany's top polar man, Arvid Fuchs. All 4 of us used air support. Now in the 1990s, because the Norwegians were doing it, we quickly managed to get a team together We got an aeroplane to the biggest airport in Antarctica, that is the control tower. We flew for 1,000 miles to get to the start point, which is where the Atlantic hits Antarctica. The ski plane dropped our team off. My colleague is Europe's #1 physiologist. He specializes in studying starvation and the effects on your body of muscle cannibalization. So he was in his element on this expedition. He monitored our calorific output. We used 11,000 calories a day. If you run a marathon, you use 2,000. We did that for 97 days. We could only eat 5,000 calories because that's what you can carry. So you have a daily deficiency of over 4,000 calories and you starve very quickly and become skeletal. You cannot wear Gore-Tex because you would die of hypothermia. You have to wear cotton, which is 100% breathable, because you're towing 500 pounds, shall we say 260 kilo, and you will sweat at -60. You cannot wear normal soft boots, because then you will not move forward, it's too heavy. You have to have big plastic boots that dig the skis and the skins in, so you can move forward for 1,800 miles. That is what in those boots happens to your toes. That is very painful for 1 hour, and then your feet get cold and stop hurting. That is gangrene, that is after 3 weeks. We knew that after 3 months we would have skin grafts. Sydney, Australia, ozone hole, skin cancer. But where we were is much worse because you're under the ozone hole. So you must cover your skin. But remember, you are towing a huge weight on a dog harness. You're breathing like hell. Every time you breathe, you cannot cover up your mouth, and therefore the lips get damaged by the sun very quickly. At night in the tent, when you sleep, your lips will close. But when you wake up in the morning, what you do is to share porridge out of one bowl. So you can't open your mouth, it's stuck together, you have to pull your lips apart. So all your blood goes in his porridge, which causes bad relations. Navigation. That man is treading on his body shadow. The sun is due north at midday. Therefore, it must be midday on his watch. That is how you navigate until the satellites arrive. Use your watch and the position of the sun. Crevasses. Well, I took a photograph of that because I could actually see it. Normally, as I said, you cannot see them until you tread onto them. So I developed a very careful policy, which is to watch the man ahead. Nobody's going to fall into that one. There is a man up there, you can see. There's a big hole there. You'd be pretty stupid to fall into that. We arrived at the South Pole. The Norwegians dropped out, pretty much dead. The only reason we carried on for the other half from the pole was because Dr. Michael Stroud had a contract with Lancet magazine, which is Europe's top medical magazine, on the topic of advanced starvation. And when we reached the South Pole, he weighed us and discovered that we were starving even more than he had hoped, and he was determined to complete the article even if he was dead, so we carried on. We did the first ever 3,000-meter descent of the Beardmore Glacier without crampons, because we lost them. I began to hate him. Basically, every 5 days he took my blood for science, didn't have much blood left. Every 8 days he made you drink a container of liquid costing $1,000. And for 24 hours after you drink it, any liquid coming out of your body has to be collected in bottles for science, especially urine. Now, to fill a pee bottle at -90 centigrade is dangerous for that part of your body if you are male. Although, obviously, at that temperature, the difference between males and females is not great. His hands got bad. The blisters will break off, leaving raw skin. By day 80, 8 of his fingers had no skin. That is my hand. A little bit later, I made a mistake for about 3 minutes, as a result of which I had the top half
of all the fingers on that hand amputated. You don't want to make mistakes in the cold. Mike and I eventually reached the Pacific, that is the coast of the Pacific, at which point we became the first human beings in history to cross the entire continent without support, which today remains the longest unsupported polar journey in history. When we got back to Europe, we completed 20 muscle biopsies without anaesthetics. I took that picture of Mike Stroud, I enjoyed taking it. We raised the sum of £4.2 million from that expedition. We started building Europe's first multiple sclerosis research centre. Altogether, our expeditions have raised £16.4 million for various charities. Each of the expeditions has a charity and a science programme, but from my point of view, that's not what it's all about. As I explained at the beginning, it happens to be my profession, and for that I need sponsorship, and for sponsorship I need the media, and to get the media we need to stay ahead of our known rivals at all times. Thank you.